On a virtual tour of a few examples of completed brownfield redevelopments in and around Baltimore. Let's give a little bit of background. As many of you know, the Voluntary Cleanup Program, or VCP, was first created by Maryland statute in 1997. There have only been a few changes over the years, but there has been a steady stream of applications over the last quarter century. Technology and site characteristics only get more complex as the years pass. Even though market changes have been occurring during the last few years, we've been surprised that the number of VCP applications have not slowed down. Between the VCP and Controlled Hazardous Substances programs, there are 307 current active projects under review. One of the policy changes in the last several years was the implementation of MDE's Residential Redevelopment and Land Use Control Policy that required 15 feet of clean fill for fee-simple projects. Through evaluation and review of EPA policies, this was later changed to 10 feet, and a new policy for handling soil contamination in the zone of saturation was added. Since its inception in 1997, the VCP has written 467 No Further Requirements determinations, or NFRDs, and 277 certificates of completion, or COCs. Many of the COCs and NFRDs require long-term monitoring and maintenance of engineering controls, such as paved and landscaped caps. Since there are over 1,000 sites in Maryland with land use control requirements, it would be impossible to inspect every property every year. Starting in January 2019, the Land Restoration Program, or LRP, contracted with Teredex to create a system to ensure that closed sites subject to land use controls continue to meet all requirements to protect the safety of construction workers and future visitors. Teredex Dig Clean advisories allow LRP to monitor and ensure compliance with land use controls in real time rather than through periodic inspections that may occur after the potentially improper construction work has already occurred. The system missed utility tickets on or near sites with restrictions to create advisories that LRP reviews before excavation of a cap. It allows LRP to identify problems before they occur and guides the need for inspections. As a result of a bill passed in the 2023 legislature, beginning October 1st of this year, VCP participants will have 60 days instead of 30 to record their NFRDs and COCs in the land records of the city or county. The pandemic exacerbated the delays in recording these documents as required, and additional time will save the documents needed for application for brownfield tax credits from being voided. In addition, the department will get an increase to 60 days for review of both VCP applications and completion reports for remedial action plans. Enough of the facts and figures. Let's look at some of the recent projects in the VCP. Let's start with the remediation and redevelopment of one of the largest redevelopment projects overseen by LRP in Baltimore Peninsula, formerly Port Covington. It is a 235-acre mixed-use development taking advantage of Baltimore City Tax Increment, or TIF financing, for which goals were exceeded for minority business and women-owned business contracts. It is the site of former industrial operations along the waterfront and began in the VCP program. Past uses of the property included many industrial and commercial operations, such as fertilizer manufacturers, locomotive coal and fueling depots, vehicular maintenance facilities, grain, molasses, and cement storage, scrap metal operations, boat manufacturers, and a briquette manufacturer. By 1988, CSX assumed ownership of the property, and by the mid-1990s, buildings were demolished and rail lines removed. In 2000, a VCP application was submitted requesting a certificate of completion. First development completed in a 35.19-acre portion of the property was a Walmart and Sam's Club. After remediation of the contaminated soils under an approved response action plan, a COC was issued for 103 East Cromwell Street on February 24, 2005. Although there were high hopes that the new retail development would thrive and spur new investment in the area, the remaining portion of the property remained vacant. The Sam's Club closed in 2007. The Walmart closed in January 2016. Acquisition of the property for the next phase in the development process for Port Covington began in 2014. Fast forward to 2023, since work began to transform Port Covington into Baltimore Gateway. Environmental work has been completed under a combination of VCP and CHS oversight. A comprehensive soil management plan was crafted to allow characterization and reuse of soil from the entire project area to allow efficient and cost-effective movement of fill material where needed. Some of the well-known businesses on remediated parcels include the City Garage, Nick's Fish House, Sagamore Spirits Distillery, and now departments and commercial buildings on the previous Baltimore Sun property. Also, fee simple townhomes and rental apartments are on the way to the former Lock Insulator property. Lock Insulator manufactured porcelain insulators at the approximately 24-acre facility from the 1920s to 2017 in a 625,000 square foot building. Yard 56 in Baltimore is another mixed-use redevelopment located across from Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center. It now has a variety of commercial and residential buildings on the site of the former Porcelain Enamel Manufacturing Company, or PIMCO. The 100-year-old industrial operations of the former PIMCO facility ended in 2006, leaving behind hazardous waste from the manufacturing process on site, along with a closed landfill and underground storage tanks. The site was contaminated with volatile organic compounds, VOCs, semi-volatile organic compounds, methane, lead, and other metals. Founded in 1911, the company produced porcelain and enamel coating for kitchen and bathroom appliances and tiles. Perhaps most notably, PIMCO supplied the orange roofing tiles for Howard Johnson hotels and restaurants. The transformation of PIMCO to Yard 56 did not happen overnight, as is typical of many VCP sites. Sometimes progress can be measured in decades rather than years. The first VCP application was submitted in 2007 for commercial purposes by the site owner. The proposed development did not occur, and buildings at the property continued to be subject to vandalism and deterioration. The current owner entered the property into the VCP in September 2014. A response action plan was submitted on November 11, 2015. The public meeting presentation summarized the investigations conducted over the years and the proposed path forward for redevelopment. This multi-million-dollar remediation effort began with the city's first federal Opportunity Zone investment from investors. The VCP process concluded in the spring of 2021 for the first development phase with the completion of the remedial action plan and the opening of a streets market grocery store, restaurants and coffee shop, a fitness center, and more. Additional development phases included office buildings and rental apartments, which are nearing completion. The development team at Yard 56 encountered and overcame several challenges that can be associated with building on a brownfield, All the buildings on the property required installation of a vapor barrier to prevent potential migration of chlorinated VOCs into the interior space. The installation of the vapor barriers across the site was meticulously overseen by the environmental professional and LRP. The following photos illustrate the procedure followed for installation of the vapor barrier. Vapor barriers are comprised of specially manufactured and tested membrane material resistant to chemicals, not just a water vapor barrier. All vapor barrier seams must be sealed per manufacturer's instructions. First, you need at least 6 inches of granular subbase. The perforated plastic piping that collects the vapors under the slab and directs them to a pipe to be mounted on the outside of the building is laid out. The perforations are protected by filter cloth. Based on the design, the multiple runs of piping are connected. The piping is covered by filter cloth to protect the vapor barrier from any sharp stones. Vapor barrier is laid out and the seams taped. All plumbing and electrical conduits must be sealed. The vapor barrier must also be sealed to the wall foundation. Once the barrier is installed, the process begins to test for leaks. A small hole is cut in the barrier and a smoke machine is used to pump smoke under the barrier. All seams and protuberances are carefully checked for leaks. Any leaks are patched. Once the vapor barrier passes, the overlying concrete slab can be poured. Once the building is completed and doors and windows are installed and the HVAC system functional, an indoor air test is conducted to ensure the vapor barrier is functioning. The design plan for the fitness center required the excavation of soil to allow the vapor barrier to be placed under the pool area and clean residential grade fill placed above the vapor barrier to allow the workers to complete the construction of the pool without concerns about site contaminants, which when one of the retail units could not pass the indoor air testing requirement due to elevated detections of chlorinated compounds, both the contractor and LRP were puzzled. After investigation of the materials used in construction of the interior of the retail unit, it was determined the glue used to attach molding to the floor contained a significant amount of some chlorinated compound that was a contaminant of concern at the site. After the unit was ventilated, subsequent indoor air testing demonstrated that levels were below the required threshold. Another challenge was building on top of closed industrial landfill with detections of methane. The design of the buildings included vapor barriers, active venting systems, and methane detectors in the residential apartment units. All utilities have a seal to prevent methane from traveling from the landfill area to other portions of the property. As a precaution, methane vents are also installed in several of the light pole installations. Construction of Yard 56 involved significant earth moving and alteration of the existing terrain. The response action plan called for capping of potential contaminated soils to prevent exposure to the future residents and visitors. Large quantities of clean fill material were also required to construct the clean fill cap. Off-site sources were identified and tested and approved to meet residential standards before import. Some on-site soil was also tested and determined to meet residential standards for reuse. As with many brownfields, sometimes unexpected contamination can be encountered, which is why it's critical to have an environmental professional on site to ensure the soil is managed properly. Especially at older urban industrial sites, petroleum-contaminated soil or unknown tanks can be encountered, and Yard 56 was not an exception. The current Lakes at Stansbury Shores is a residential community in Dundalk across Bear Creek and the site of a former petroleum terminal that ceased operations in the 1980s. Before that, agricultural use. The Johns Hopkins University received the property as a donation in 1992. Stansbury Shores LLC acquired it in 2006. On the site was a 1 million gallon above ground storage tank, AST, that was raised in 2003 and required approximately 21,890 cubic yards of soil to be excavated and treated using ex situ bioremediation. A January 2007 report detailed the excavation of 15 test pits throughout the property, including the former petroleum AST and the warehouse building, which had formerly been occupied by a printing company. Soil samples collected in the vicinity of the warehouse building contained elevated levels of arsenic in a black silt material. In January 2007, an additional 23 soil borings and 18 test pits were conducted near the former AST and warehouse. A response action plan was developed that detailed the removal of the contaminated soil. Contaminated soil was removed and disposed of as cover at a local landfill. Since a new cell was being excavated at the same landfill and the soil had been tested to meet residential standards, this material could be used at the Lakes of Stansbury Shores. A plan was implemented to clean each dump truck bed after each load before loading clean fill for the return trip. Testing was conducted to confirm that all contaminated soil had been removed. The site was brought up to grade with clean fill and the housing community was completed. Brownfield site remediation and redevelopment can sometimes occur in unique ways. The new Topgolf facility in Baltimore built its facility on the site of Parking Lot J of M&T Stadium and Baltimore Animal Rescue and Care Shelter Incorporated, BARCS, and its offices. BARCS received a new $12 million facility from public funds used from the sale of the properties to Topgolf. Topgolf also remediated the neighboring Ridgely's Cove Park and provided improvements to the parts of the nearby Gwynns Falls Trail.
I just want to thank MDE for that amazing video, compilating a lot of those great case studies from across the state and related to the voluntary cleanup program as well. So thanks. It was Richard Garner, is that correct, Barbara? And so now we have Barbara Brown, voluntary cleanup program lead, Maryland Department of Environment, is available to lead a discussion. Appreciate it. Thanks, Barbara.
Hello, does anybody have any questions?
So that vapor barrier stuff, that's all only under the structures, not the grounds and the parking lots?
Right, it's only under the buildings. Because if it's in the parking lots and all, it's basically breathing, but what you worry about is anything that's volatile coming into the building itself that will sort of cage them and people that are there being exposed to them.
Okay, I was just curious about that because it seemed like it would make everything impervious, but it's obviously pervious.
So how does MDE reach decisions or make decisions about what levels of contaminants are okay for residential versus recreational use versus industrial use after a site is cleaned up?
When a site is evaluated on the VCP application, there's a land use that's selected. So when you come into the voluntary cleanup program, you have 4 choices. Residential, which can include rental and fee simple. Commercial, which is your standard shopping center or a showroom at an industrial facility that has access to child visitor. Industrial, which is basically a site that's fenced and has workers that are above the age of 18. And then recently, in the last couple of years, we've added recreational. So you can have recreational that might be a daycare. That's high-frequency recreational. You could have ball fields that are only used during, certain times of the year and only have certain hours of exposure. So that would be mid-level recreational. And then you might have something that's a walking path. That could be low-frequency recreational. So when that application comes in, we look at that data compared to, first, our screening levels as far as what's in the soil, groundwater, and soil gas, as to say, okay, do we have something here that exceeds our screening level? So each land use will have different levels to reach. So, of course, residential is the most stringent, where you could potentially, let's use arsenic as like an example. So you can probably accept if it's just arsenic, because we also look at cumulative effects. If there's other constituents in the soil, you could have arsenic potentially up to 10 parts per million. Commercial, you could have it up to 20 parts per million, and industrial, you could have it up to maybe around 28 parts per million. But when you apply a remedy, like it was done for Yard 56 and these other areas, you're basically creating an interruption in the exposure pathway. So some things we basically call chasers, volatiles, they move, groundwater moves, can carry for soil gas, but some things like metals and other constituents just sit in the soil. So if you remove the pathway and put a cap, you are basically insulating anybody using it from the underlying soil. So you could have a residential rental that could have higher levels of contamination, but if you have a cap, it prevents exposure, and that's why we have land use controls, to make sure that that cap is maintained in perpetuity. So again, there's different standards to say something's clean, that you would have to have no cap or no further monitoring, versus if you have a response action plan that says we're going to do as an engineering remedy to prevent exposure.
Do you have any examples of, say, after you've applied land use controls, where those might have conflicted with what the local comprehensive plan or zoning was permitting on that property, how a local government responded with those other policy and regulatory documents?
And that's a very interesting question, because when the VCP statutes were crafted in 1997, anytime there's a response action plan, the applicant has to sign and verify that, they say, I'm going to build a 10,000 square foot warehouse, but it's not zoned for that. So they have to sign off to say the remedy they're proposing, AKA through their dual use development, meets local land use standards. So we don't override local jurisdictions. We like to work with local jurisdictions, but whatever's proposed has to also go through local permitting, local zoning, local master plan approval. So we don't interfere with that process.
So at what stage does that proposal have to be vetted through the local plan and zoning? Is it after the assessment, when they get a sense of what the land use controls might be? Because I could see an area is zoned for residential. I mean, this is probably not a likely example, especially if you're dealing with the Brownfield site, but it's zoned for residential, then they find out through the land use controls and the assessments that they're not going to be able to reach that threshold for remediation for residential.
Well, the zoning comes in usually after the initial application, the review of the data, and the remedy selection. So at the end of the process, so if you propose you're going to build a building, it would have to be approved. So if you come in for the land use and you don't have the zoning, you could have an NFRD if the site was clean, but you couldn't build whatever you wanted there. It would still have to go through the local master plan and local approval. So you sort of have, and we have a process going now with a site up in Frederick, the Frederick Brickworks, that they've come into the VCP and they've proposed their master plan to Frederick City. But whether they move forward in the program will depend on if they get approval of their master plan. So a lot of times when you have a site that you're doing brownfields redevelopment, there's multiple pathways that you have to consider. Not only is the environmental issues, how you're going to remedy it, but dealing with the community, getting approval, the designs, going through the permitting process and public participation. So all of that has to be incorporated in how you schedule moving forward. And sometimes the environmental stuff is easy and quick, and it's the permitting and design approval that takes longer.
Thank you.
Do you ever have a situation where EPA has changed its standards related to hazardous substances, and that impacts how you set your standards moving forward for land use protections?
Toxicologists are always looking at data about exposure pathways, and sometimes for certain constituents, numbers go up, numbers go down. But our screening level standards get reviewed, I believe it's every 2 years or every 4 years, and we can adjust based on what the new data has from EPA. So it's a constantly evolving risk assessment process.
Anybody else, feel free to, if you have questions, please come on up. But I can continue to think of some that might be of interest. Do you want to go, John?
Yeah, your video had like the marquee projects, the big ones, right? Can you talk about redevelopments on smaller scale things such as former dry cleaners, former gas stations, and other types of things like that?
Yeah, and again, we have some sites that are small as like, a tenth of an acre, and some sites like Sparrows Point that are 3,000 acres. So a lot of times when we deal with dry cleaners, we're dealing with refinancing. A dry cleaner, a shopping center's been there since the 60s. It's had a dry cleaner there for a long time, and it's either being sold to someone or they need the bank financing, and then you go and you find out they have a chlorinated solvent problem. We've also helped through our CHS some of the smaller municipalities and Baltimore City look at areas that have had townhomes or row homes that they've demolished and they're going to put in a park. And again, even though you think it's residential had lead paint that flaked off into the soil. They had underground storage tanks for heating. They had potential asbestos that flaked off. So that's some of the sites that we get involved with that are small to help people come up with a sampling plan, review the results, make recommendations so that they can, bid it out to get it cleaned up. So we've also had some good success with people using HUD money. The Perkins Green in Baltimore City redevelopment is coming through the VCP using HUD money to demolish the older public housing and replace it with, better quality housing, a school, and some of those other things. So again, we have a variety of different sites that have either been through the VCP or in the VCP now.
So over so you've been doing this, I think, for about 25 years or so on the VCP side, right? And what have you seen as like the biggest pitfalls that these sites have encountered that have prevented them from succeeding in getting cleaned up or getting reused?
A lot of times it's the quality of the phase one. If you have a good phase one, you can make a good business decision about whether you're going to go forward with acquisition. Where you run into problems is expenses if your phase one missed something, or they made recommendations that really weren't based on the facts and the sample results. Unfortunately, it seems like in the last 10 or 15 years, the biggest problem with VCP sites have been market conditions. So we've had sites that, Westport Waterfront, I think we're on our 5th applicant, that they came in the early 2000s with grandiose plans, and the market just wasn't there. So then it passed to another person who bought it from bankruptcy that had grandiose plans and got ready to roll, and the market just wasn't there. And then finally, we have another developer that's come in with some really good solid plans for incorporating affordable housing, incorporating public parks, incorporating apartments and retail, and that got derailed, pardon the expression, by the maglev train lawsuit. So now that that's settled, finally after that came in like 2000, and now we're at 2023, finally that project will start to move forward.
Can you elaborate about why not having a good enough phase one is a problem?
Well, the phase one is the basis of looking for what we call recognized environmental concerns. So if the phase one does a complete history of the site, you go back through property records, interviews with property owners, records that we have at MDE, so that you have knowledge of what might have occurred at the site. And if you have sites in Baltimore City, I mean, you may have industrial uses that date back to the 1900s. And there's information at the libraries, there's old insurance maps that basically, you could have a site that hasn't been a gas station for 50 years, but if you start looking at your phase one and say, okay, this was a little corner gas station, then the red flag goes up, well, there still could be tanks there, or there could be petroleum, or they could have had PCBs if they recycled waste oil. So that guides you moving forward with what type of sampling you need to do, what type of issues you may have. Am I going to be dealing with, if I'm digging footers, am I going to have contaminated soil that I'm going to have to use? But if the phase one doesn't do such a thorough investigation of the history, then you might miss something that comes back and bites you later on because you missed that, and now all of a sudden you're spending money dealing with PCB soils or dealing with getting tanks out of the ground when you're actually digging. So again, the better the phase one, the better the process is moving forward.
As a city planner, what obligation do you think we should have if we're approached with a development proposal that we may be aware it had cleanup issues in the past? Should we be asking for a proof of compliance, certificate of completion? Do we have an obligation to do so? Are we liable if it's developed and we find problems down the road came up?
Well, that's always one of the biggest issues with Develop in Maryland, because we're a voluntary program. So people come into us with their applications for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's what we call voluntary at gunpoint because they need to get bank financing, or they want to make an informed business decision to buy the property, or the biggest carrot's a Brownfield tax credit. So a lot of the local jurisdictions struggle with how much information do I ask for, how much do we have in our statutes that say we can ask for anything environmental. We've had some people argue at public hearings, well, that's not in your statute to ask about environmental stuff. All you need to worry about is, are there, capacity in the schools, you don't have. So, I mean, at the very least, if you have somebody that has a phase one, that shows there might be contamination, but again, I think it's an opportunity for improvement in the future to help local jurisdictions deal with environmental questions. But it's difficult right now from a liability and legal perspective, just how deep can you ask people to go? Now, we've had some municipalities that are doing development in a potentially contaminated site says, we'll give you your building permit when you have an approved response action plan, or we'll give you your building permit when you get a no further requirements determination. So again, it depends on what your particular municipality, allows you to do, and how much if you have the expertise on site, or if you have your own consultant. But again, a lot of smaller places don't have someone on staff that helps review, sites for potential environmental issues.
If a site was previously in a VCP and got a COC, and resampling how would MDE handle that formerly issued COC?
Now, if it has a COC and it has a cap or it has a vapor barrier, you're going to have variation in sampling with laboratory. You're not always going to get the same number for the same soil. So, and as long as that cap is still in place, you're fine, because sometimes property changes hands and people come in and do due diligence and do new sampling. If the site had an NFRD, say in 2010, a new tenant moved in and may have spilled something or installed a fueling system or done something that caused new contamination, that would not be covered under the old NFRD. So what we would look at is, where is it, what is it, when do we think it occurred? One of the issues we also have with changing technologies is, back when all this started, soil gas was not really something that people looked at. So you could have a property that had an NFRD back in 1998 or 2000 that comes back in and does subslab soil gas and then finds an issue. So in those cases, people can rejoin, get a new COC that sort of updates what the current conditions are, or a new NFRD. So again, a lot of our sites, we joke, nothing ever goes away. I mean, we've had some sites come back and forth in the VCP or portions of the site. And also, too, with the way the VCP is, you can have a change in land use. So say you built a warehouse, but now, things have changed and this is a great area for rental apartments. Well, you can come back to us for a change in land use and get a new application and new data and new remedy, and then get a new document that supersedes the old one that changes the land use. So there's a lot of flexibility in the program, so it's whatever you get isn't always written in stone, that you can always do more work to change it, as long as it's protective of human health is the main thing that we look at.
Second question, do you have a minimum thickness of vapor barrier? Minimum thickness requirement for vapor barriers?
When we first started doing vapor barriers, there's only like 1 or 2 manufacturers that do it. Now there's like 6 or 7. So some of them are like anywhere from like 15 millimeters, and then some of the heavy-duty ones go up to 40. So a lot of times you'll get the company will say this is meant to be used as a vapor barrier for chlorinated solvents or for petroleum. So they'll basically certify that this material was manufactured specifically for this use.
Once you have in place limits for allowable amounts of PFAS and PFOAs, do you see that as potentially slowing down the ability to redevelop brownfields in Maryland, or not? I wasn't sure how much of a hindrance it's going to be in terms of remediation technologies and costs and that sort of thing.
Well, I think I might punt on that one to higher up the food chain. But again, having been here for a long time, there was always the new chemical concern. MTBE, that was a gasoline additive, was going to ruin everything. Perchlorate from munitions was going to ruin everything. But, PFAS is going to be something that people will have to come to grips with how they're going to deal with it. But we're already dealing with things that are much more toxic, hexavalent chrome, arsenic. So in groundwater use areas, it may become much more critical, but the detection limits for PFAS and the proposed drinking water standards and soil standards, you're starting to talk about parts per trillion. Not just parts per million, parts per billion, but parts per trillion. So, there's going to be a lot of discussion among EPA, the different states, on how you deal with that. But again, we've had similar historical situations where, you deal with it. It might make clean fill sampling more complicated. I know some states like New York are already asking people to sample for PFAS in their fill. It's a very difficult sampling. It's in so many things that We joke that you're sampling naked at midnight, with no pizza boxes, because there's just so much of it out there that cross-contamination is always a big concern. So, it's what they call an emerging contaminant. So we'll stay tuned for further developments.
Well, I just wanted to say, especially because the PFAS are still being used. It's not even like there's yet been any type of a ban, right? So it's going to continue to emerge well beyond the time that it would if they were no longer being used in products and goods, correct?
That, and well, you also look at, as an analogy, we're still putting gasoline in gasoline tanks. So, and we're still using chemicals for dry cleaning. We're still using, so, again, that's true, but that's also true of a lot of other things as well. But,
So it's a matter of better handling practices?
Better handling practices, okay. Perhaps, coming up with treatment technologies for it, and also understanding what's the actual risk that it presents, because there's so many different types of PFAS and PFOA with the fluoride change. So, getting a handle on the risk of each type of compound is going to keep a lot of smart people busy for a very long time. So,
well, we got to keep those smart people employed.
You right. But so that there's a lot on the horizon that needs to be determined, and a lot will depend on when EPA makes their final determination on if all PFASs are listed as hazardous substances, and then that would bring it back under the purview of what the voluntary cleanup program does.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.